The call that changed everything. It was a quiet evening in California when Sundar Pichai's phone buzzed on the glass table. He was sitting alone in his living room, staring out the window, thinking about the long week at Google headquarters. The sun was fading into a soft orange behind the hills. He almost ignored the call, thinking it was just another reporter or a colleague needing something. But then he saw the name on the screen. It said Appa. His father. He picked up quickly. "Appa?" he said softly, his voice already heavy with emotion. It had been months since they'd spoken properly, months buried under deadlines and meetings and flights. On the other end, there was a pause, a deep breath, and then the voice of his father came, quiet but full of weight. "Sundar, I need your help," his father said. The words hung in the air. Sundar's heart beat faster. He hadn't heard his father sound like that in years. Not since the days when they lived in a tiny apartment in Chennai, before Sundar left for the United States, before he became the CEO of Google, before the world knew his name. "Of course, Appa," Sundar said, trying to keep his tone calm. "What's wrong?" And then his father began to speak, telling a story Sundar never expected to hear. The family back home was in trouble. Something about land that was being taken away, an old friend turned enemy, money missing from accounts. His mother crying every night. It sounded impossible. It sounded like something from another lifetime. As his father's voice cracked on the line, Sundar felt himself pulled back to that old apartment, the walls thin as paper. The smell of spices and dust. His father coming home late from work, tired but proud. His mother always keeping food warm no matter how late it got. And Sundar himself, a skinny boy with big dreams and second-hand books. Too shy to speak up, always watching, always hoping. "Please," his father said at last. "Just come. Just once. We need you." And then there was silence. Sundar couldn't find his voice for a moment. His throat was tight. Finally, he whispered, "I'll be there." He hung up the phone and sat in the quiet room for a long time. Outside, the sky turned dark. The city lights below glittered like stars. He stared at them but didn't really see them. His mind was already thousands of miles away, back in India, back in the streets where he grew up. He packed his bag that night. Only a few clothes, a notebook, his passport. He left a note for his wife and children, saying he had to go for a few days. He didn't say much more because he didn't even know what to say at the airport. He kept his head down. People still recognized him sometimes. They'd come up to him, smiling, asking for a photo or a handshake. But tonight he wasn't Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google. Tonight, he was just a son going home. The flight was long, and he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, memories flooded in. His father teaching him how to fix a broken fan. His mother sewing his school uniform. The day he got his scholarship to Stanford, and his father had sold their only scooter to pay for his ticket. He remembered the look on his father's face. That day, proud, but also sad, knowing his son was leaving for good. He landed in Chennai early in the morning. The air was warm and thick. As he stepped out of the airport, the smells and sounds hit him all at once. Spices, diesel, the cries of street vendors, the hum of 1,000 lives moving at once. It was exactly as he remembered. And yet, everything felt different. A car was waiting for him, sent by a family friend. The driver was an old man with kind eyes. He didn't say much, just nodded and drove. Sundar stared out the window as the city passed by. Crowded markets, colorful temples, skinny dogs sleeping. In the sun, he saw children walking to school, holding hands, laughing just like he used to. When they reached his childhood home, Sundar felt his chest tighten. The building looked older, the paint peeling, the windows cracked. But it was still home. He stepped out of the car and stood there for a moment, just looking. Then the door opened, and his mother came rushing out. She looked smaller than he remembered, her hair more gray, but her eyes lit up when she saw him. "Sundar." She cried and threw her arms around him. He hugged her tightly, feeling a lump in his throat. She smelled of jasmine and warmth. "Appa is inside," she whispered. "He's waiting." When Sundar walked into the living room, he saw his father sitting in his old chair, staring at the floor. He looked up slowly, and their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then his father said, "You came." Sundar nodded, swallowing hard. Of course. His father stood, his hand shaking slightly. He didn't hug Sundar, but he put a hand on his shoulder and squeezed it, the way he always did when he didn't know what to say. Sundar understood. He always understood. They sat down, and his father began to explain everything. The land next to their home, land that had belonged to their family for generations, was being taken by a powerful man in the neighborhood. The papers were forged. The officials were bribed. His father had tried to fight, but they were poor and powerless. Now, men came to the house almost every day, shouting, threatening. Sundar's mother cried herself to sleep. "I didn't want to bother you," his father said, his voice breaking. "But I don't know what else to do." Sundar listened quietly. He could feel anger rising in his chest. Not just anger at the men who were hurting his family, but also at himself, for being so far away, for not knowing sooner. "We'll fix this," he said firmly. "I promise." That night, he couldn't sleep. He walked through the small apartment, touching the old walls, the faded pictures on the shelves. He stood on the balcony and looked out at the street below. Everything looked the same, but he felt like a stranger. He thought about all the years he'd spent climbing the ladder in Silicon Valley, all the nights he stayed late at the office, all the weekends he missed with his family. Was it all worth it if he couldn't protect the people who mattered most? The next morning, he decided to visit the man who was trying to take their land. Against his mother's protests and his father's fear, he insisted. "I need to see him face to face," Sundar said. He dressed simply, in an old shirt and trousers, and walked through the neighborhood. People stared as he passed, whispering his name. Some of them smiled, some just watched silently. Sundar kept his head high, but his mind was racing. He didn't know what he would say. He just knew he couldn't let this happen. When he reached the large house at the end of the street, the house of Rayesh, the man responsible, he stopped. The gate was open. Two men stood outside, watching him with cold eyes. "I need to speak to Rayesh," Sundar said evenly. The men exchanged a glance. One of them snorted. "And who are you?" "Just tell him," Sundar replied. One of the men disappeared inside. A few minutes later, Rayesh himself appeared at the door. He was a big man with sharp eyes and a cruel smile. He walked down, stepped slowly, clapping his hands. Well, he said mockingly. "Look who's come home. The great Sundar Pichai." Sundar stood still. "Leave my family alone," he said quietly. "Stop what you're doing." Rayesh laughed, a harsh, hollow sound. "You think you can walk in here and tell me what to do? You may be a big man in America, but here, you're just another nobody." Sundar felt his hands clench into fists. But he forced himself to stay calm. "You don't have to do this," he said. "There's still time to do the right thing." Rayesh stepped closer, his smile fading. His voice dropped to a low growl. "Get out of here before you regret coming back." Sundar stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away. But inside, something had shifted. He knew now this wouldn't be easy. And he also knew he couldn't back down. That night, as he sat with his parents at the kitchen table, he began to hatch a plan. A plan that would change everything. For him, for his family, and for the entire neighborhood. But just as he was about to tell them, there was a loud knock at the door. A hard, angry knock that made his mother jump and his father's face go pale. Sundar stood slowly and walked to the door. He opened it, and there, standing in the doorway, was someone he never expected to see. Someone from his past. Someone who held the power to destroy everything he was trying to protect. Asterisk the stranger at the door. Knock at the door came again. Louder. This time, and the sound seemed to shake the thin walls of the little apartment. Sundar stood frozen for half a second, his hand still resting on the table where he had been sketching a plan with a pencil. His mother gasped softly behind him, pressing her fingers to her lips, and his father's face went pale as chalk. For a moment, no one moved. The knock came again, 3 sharp raps that carried a quiet menace, as though whoever stood on the other side already knew there was fear inside. Sundar straightened his back, trying to calm the storm inside his chest. Without a word, he walked toward the door. Each step felt heavy, the air in the room thick with dread. When he finally reached the door and grasped the handle, he took a slow breath before pulling it open. Standing there in a narrow frame was a man Sundar hadn't seen in over 20 years. He was taller than Sundar remembered, broader too, though his shoulders slumped as if they carried an invisible weight. His hair, once black and full, was now streaked with gray, his jaw shadowed with stubble. His clothes, a worn shirt and dusty trousers, told of a man who had worked hard, maybe too hard for too long. But his eyes were unmistakable. They were the same deep brown that Sundar remembered from their boyhood, though now they looked older, tired, haunted. For a long moment they simply stared at each other, the silence between them thick enough to choke on. Then the man spoke. "Hello, Sundar," he said, his voice low, raspy. "You shouldn't have come back." Sundar blinked, his mind still. Catching up to what he was seeing, "Raymond," he said at last, his own voice unsteady. "Is it really you?" Raymond nodded slightly, though his expression remained hard, guarded. "It's me," he said. "But I'm not here for a reunion. I came to warn you." Before Sundar could respond, Raymond stepped past him into the room. The faint smell of sweat and smoke clung to him as he moved, and his presence seemed to fill the small space. His mother backed away toward the kitchen, and his father stood up slowly, his hands clenched at his sides. Sundar closed the door and turned to face him, his chest tight with questions. "Warn me?" Sundar asked carefully. "About what?" Raymond glanced around, his eyes flicking toward the window, then toward the back door, as though he expected someone to burst in at any moment. Then he lowered his voice to barely more than a whisper. "You don't know what you've walked into, Sundar. Rayesh isn't just a thug with some muscle. He's got the police in his pocket. Judges, too. People who cross him. They don't just lose their land. Sometimes they disappear." His words hung heavy in the air. Sundar felt a chill crawl up the back of his neck. But he forced himself to stand taller, to meet Raymond's gaze. "And you?" he asked. "Why are you here? Are you working for him now?" Something flickered across Raymond's face. Shame, perhaps, or pain, but it vanished quickly behind his hardened mask. "I do what I have to," he muttered. "I've got a wife. They need to eat. He pays me, and I keep my head down." Sundar's jaw tightened. "So you're one of his men now, coming here to scare me off." Raymond shook his head quickly, stepping closer, lowering his voice even further. "No, I'm here because I remember who you were. Because I still owe you." His eyes softened for a moment, and Sundar caught a glimpse of the boy he used to know. The boy who had sat beside him in school, who had shared his lunch when Sundar went hungry, who had defended him from bullies. He once stood up for me when no one else would, Raymond continued. "And now, I can't let you walk into this blind." Sundar felt his breath catch in his chest. The memories came rushing back. 2 skinny boys huddled over books, whispering dreams of a better future. The years hadn't been kind to either of them, but Raymond's eyes still held that spark of loyalty buried beneath the years of hardship. "Then help me," Sundar said quietly. "Help me fight him." Raymond looked away, staring at the floor, his jaw working as though the words hurt to speak. "You don't understand," he said. "You can't win against him. Not here, not like this." But Sundar reached out, gripping Raymond's arm. "You said you owe me," he said, his voice firm. "Then tell me everything you know. Show me where he's weak. If we can get proof, real proof, we can take him down." Raymond hesitated for a long moment. Then he finally nodded, his shoulders sagging as though the decision itself had exhausted him. "Fine," he murmured. "But if anyone finds out I helped you, they'll kill me." "They won't," Sundar promised. "I won't let them." That night, under the cover of darkness, Raymond led Sundar through the back alleys of the neighborhood. The streets were quiet, empty except for the occasional bark of a dog or the distant hum of a scooter. They walked quickly, heads down, speaking only in hushed tones. He keeps all the papers in a locked room, Raymond explained. Contracts, bribes, fake deeds. I've seen them. If you can get those papers and show them to the right people, maybe, just maybe, you can stop him. Where is this room? Sundar asked. Raymond gave him a grim smile. In his warehouse, on the edge of town, guarded night and day. As they walked, Sundar felt a strange mix of fear and determination building inside him. Every step brought him closer to the truth, closer to the heart of the storm. He thought of his parents sitting back at home, waiting, afraid. He thought of the neighborhood children watching him as he walked past earlier, their eyes full of quiet hope. And he thought of Rayesh's cruel smile, the way he had sneered when he told Sundar he was nothing here. Sundar clenched his fists. He would show him. He would show them all. When they finally reached the warehouse, Raymond pointed to a narrow alley that ran along the side of the building. We can get in through the back, he whispered, but only for a few minutes. The guards take a smoke break every hour on the hour. After that, we're done. Sundar nodded. Together they crouched in the shadows, waiting for the moment. When the guards finally stepped outside, laughing and lighting cigarettes, Raymond motioned for him to follow. They slipped through the back door and into the cool darkness of the warehouse. Inside, the air smelled of dust and oil. Tall shelves lined the walls, stacked with crates and boxes. Raymond led him down a narrow corridor, finally stopping at a heavy wooden door. He pulled a key from his pocket and quickly unlocked it. The door creaked open to reveal a small office, cluttered with papers and files. Here, Raymond said. Look fast. Sundar moved to the desk, his heart pounding. He flipped through the stacks of documents, scanning them quickly. Forged deeds, lists of bribes, threats written on official letterhead. It was all here, proof of everything. He stuffed as many papers as he could into his bag, his hands shaking. We have to go. Raymond hissed, glancing nervously at the door. They'll be back any second. But just as they turned to leave, they heard the sound of footsteps outside the room. Heavy, fast, and growing closer. Sundar froze. Raymond swore under his breath, his eyes darting around the room. They're early, he whispered. We have to hide. They ducked behind a tall filing cabinet just as the door swung open. Through the gap, Sundar could see two men enter, both of them large, their faces grim. One of them carried a flashlight, sweeping it across the room. Someone's been here, the man muttered. The door was unlocked. The other man frowned, picking up one of the scattered papers on the desk. Find them, he growled. Now, Sundar felt his breath catch in his throat. He could feel the heat of Raymond's shoulder pressed against his. The men began searching the room, opening drawers, kicking over boxes. The beam of the flashlight moved closer and closer to their hiding place. Sundar's heart was pounding so loud he was certain they could hear it. Then the beam stopped, just inches away from where they crouched. One of the men leaned in, peering into the shadows. Sundar held his breath, every muscle in his body tensed. And then, without warning, the man lunged forward, grabbing Sundar by the collar and dragging him into the light. Well, the man sneered. Look what we found. Raymond tried to fight back, swinging at the second man, but he was quickly overpowered. They forced Sundar and Raymond to their feet, twisting their arms behind their backs. You shouldn't have come here, the first man hissed. Now you're going to pay. As they were dragged out of the room, Sundar caught one last glimpse of the papers he had managed to grab, still clutched tightly in his hand. Proof. Hope. But would it be enough? Outside, the night air was sharp and cold. The men pushed them into the alley, their grips like iron dot, and then Sundar saw him, standing at the end of the alley, bathed in the glow of a streetlight. Rayesh, his arms crossed, his face a mask of cruel amusement. You really thought you could beat me? Rayesh called out, his voice echoing off the walls. You had no idea what you've started. And as Sundar met Rayesh's gaze, he felt a deep, quiet rage ignite inside him, stronger than fear, stronger than pain. He knew this was only the beginning. Asterisk the fight for justice. Ali was silent. But for the sound of Sundar's own breathing, harsh and uneven in his chest. He felt the rough cement beneath his knees, the bruising grip of the men who held him there. Raymond stood a few feet away, his lips split and bleeding, his head bowed in quiet defeat. In front of them, bathed in the pale light of the street lamp, stood Rayesh, his arms crossed, a faint smirk on his lips. The faint smell of smoke and sweat hung in the air, mingling with the sour tang of fear. Sundar forced himself to lift his head, to meet Rayesh's eyes. Even now, even after everything, he refused to look away. You never learn, do you? Rayesh said, his voice calm, almost amused. He stepped closer, his polished shoes crunching over the broken glass on the ground. You think you can come? Back here, after all these years, wave your big American title around and scare me? No, Sundar, you don't scare me. This is my place. Sundar swallowed hard, but his hands tightened into fists at his sides. This isn't about fear, he said, his voice hoarse but steady. This is about what's right. Asterisk, Rayesh chuckled, shaking his head. Right, he repeated, almost as if the word tasted strange on his tongue. Then he leaned down until his face was inches from Sundar's. Here's what's right. The strong take what they want. The weak beg for scraps. That's the way it's always been. Then he straightened, motioning to his men. Teach him a lesson, he said simply, but leave him alive. I want him to remember who owns this street. Sundar braced himself, but just as the first blow landed, sharp and hot against his RIBS, he caught sight of the papers still clutched in his hand. Somehow, through the chaos of being dragged and beaten, he had held on to them. That thought kept him going. Every punch, every kick, every sneering word, he endured them because of those papers. Because they were proof. Because they meant he wasn't powerless. When it was over, he lay on the ground, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The men stepped back, wiping their hands, and Rayesh leaned down one last time. You should leave while you still can, he said, his voice almost gentle. Next time, you won't walk away. Then they were gone, their footsteps fading into the night. Raymond stumbled to Sundar's side, helping him sit up. His own face was bloodied, his shirt torn. He looked at Sundar with something like regret in his eyes. I told you, he murmured, you can't win. But Sundar shook his head, wincing as pain shot through his ribs. We're not finished, he whispered, when they finally made it back to the apartment. His mother cried when she saw them, pressing a towel to Sundar's face, scolding him through her tears. His father sat silently at the table, staring at the floor, his hands knotted together. Sundar said nothing at first, letting them fuss over him, letting the weight of the night settle in his chest. But when the house grew quiet and his mother finally fell asleep in her chair, he pulled himself to his feet, clutching the stack of stolen papers. I need to find someone who will listen, he said to Raymond, who still lingered in the corner. Arms crossed. Raymond looked up, eyes tired. No one will listen. Not here. But Sundar shook his head. Then I'll make them listen. The next morning, still aching from the beating, he walked to the office of a lawyer he remembered from his childhood, a man named Krishnan, known in the neighborhood for his stubborn sense of justice. The office was small and cluttered with old law books stacked on every surface and the smell of ink and dust hanging in the air. Krishnan looked up from his desk as Sundar entered, his eyes narrowing. Well, he said dryly, look who the wind dragged in. Sundar set the papers on the desk without a word. Krishna picked them up, his eyebrows rising as he read. After a few moments, he let out a low whistle. You've been busy? He said. Can you help me? Sundar asked, his voice quiet but firm. Krishnan sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers. These are serious accusations, he said. Bribes, forged deeds, threats, if even half of this is true. He shook his head slowly. But you're going up against someone who owns the police, the judges, probably even the press. You ready for that? Sundar didn't hesitate. I'm ready. Christian studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. Then let's file. By the time they left the courthouse later that day, the sun was low in the sky and the first whispers had already begun to spread. People in the street watched Sundar as he passed, some nodding steadily in approval, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Back at the apartment, his parents were waiting for him, their expressions a mix of fear and pride. "You've started something," his father said quietly. "You can't stop now," Sundar nodded. "I don't intend to." But the fight was just beginning. Over the next few days, he and Krishnan worked tirelessly to gather more evidence, speaking to neighbors who had been threatened, finding witnesses who had been too afraid to come forward. Sundar walked the streets every day, speaking to anyone who would listen, promising them protection, telling them they were not alone. Some people slammed their doors in his face. Others wept and told him everything, but Rayesh struck back quickly. The very next morning, Sundar woke to find a notice nailed to the front door of the apartment. A court order claiming his parents' home had already been sold and they had 24 hours to vacate. His mother broke down when she read it. Clutching his arm, his father simply sat down, staring at the wall, silent and still. Sundar felt the familiar heat of anger rise in his chest. But he kept his voice steady as he tore the notice from the door. "He's desperate," he said. "That means we're winning." But the next blow came harder. The court hearing was rushed, far earlier than expected, and the judge assigned to the case seemed uninterested from the start. He barely glanced at the evidence before dismissing it outright, siding with Rayesh. His gavel fell with a sharp, final sound, and Sundar felt the weight of it in his bones dot outside the courthouse. His mother clung to his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "What now?" she whispered. "It's over, isn't it?" But Sundar shook his head. "It's not over," he said, though doubt had already begun to creep into his mind. "Not yet." That evening, he stood on the roof of the apartment, staring out at the street below. The neighborhood was quiet, the air heavy with defeat. He thought about everything he had done, the night spent collecting evidence, the bruises on his ribs, the whispers of hope that had begun to grow in the community. And yet here he stood, empty-handed, with nothing to show for it but a family on the verge of losing everything got, and then something unexpected happened. One by one, the neighbors began to emerge from their homes. They gathered in the street below. First a few, then dozens, then more. Some carried candles. Others held placards scrawled with words of protest. They looked up at Sundar, their faces solemn but determined. One of the women, an old teacher from his childhood, stepped forward and raised her voice. "We're with you, Sundar," she called out. "Whatever happens, we're with you." Sundar felt a lump rise in his throat. He descended the stairs slowly and stepped outside into the middle of the crowd. They parted to let him through, and he turned to face them, his heart beating hard. "We can't let him win," Sundar said, his voice carrying across the street. "He thinks he can scare us into silence. He thinks we'll look the other way. But if we stand together, he can't ignore us. He can't hurt all of us." The crowd murmured in agreement, some nodding, others raising their candles higher. Sundar felt something shift inside him, a quiet strength, a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. But just as the first chance of protest began to rise, there was a sudden roar from the end of the street. Sundar turned just in time to see a group of Rayesh's men spilling out of a truck, carrying torches and shouting threats. Before Sundar could react, one of the men hurled a torch at the house next door, the flames catching instantly, spreading across the wooden walls like a hungry beast. People screamed and scattered as the fire roared to life, the heat intense and blinding. Sundar ran toward the flames, shouting for buckets of water, but the fire was already climbing, licking at the roof, filling the air with thick, choking smoke. He turned just in time to see Rayesh himself, standing at the edge of the chaos, his arms crossed, his mouth twisted into a cruel smile. Their eyes met through the haze of smoke and flame, and Sundar saw the message written clearly in his gaze. "You will burn before you win." But even as the fire raged, even as the crowd panicked and the flames devoured the walls, Sundar felt his Resolve hardened, because he knew this was no longer just about his family. This was about all of them. He turned back to the crowd, his voice hoarse but strong. "Don't give up," he shouted over the roar of the fire. "This is what he wants, to scare us, to make us run. But we won't run. We fight. We fight until the very end." And though fear flickered in their eyes, one by one, they began to nod. One by one, they stepped forward, and together they began to battle the flames. But as Sundar turned back toward the inferno, a sudden crack split the air, the sound of wood giving way, and the roof of the burning house collapsed inward with a deafening crash. And through the smoke, Sundar saw something, or someone trapped inside, someone calling his name. Asterisk, the turning point there was thick with smoke, so heavy it clawed at Sundar's lungs with every breath. The roar of the fire had grown deafening, a hungry sound that swallowed everything, the cries of neighbors, the hiss of water thrown from buckets, the crash of wood collapsing in on itself. Sundar stood frozen for the briefest of moments, staring at the jagged black silhouette of the burning house, his ears ringing. Then he heard it again, faint but unmistakable. His name carried on the choking wind. Someone was trapped inside. Someone was calling him Dot without thinking. He surged forward, pushing through the crowd of neighbors. Someone grabbed at his arm, shouting, but he shook them off. The heat hit him like a wall as he reached the doorway, flames dancing dangerously close. For a split second, his body screamed at him to stop, to turn back. But he clenched his jaw and forced himself through the threshold. Dot inside. The air was even worse, suffocating and blinding, the smoke so thick it felt like solid walls pressing in on him. He dropped low, crawling across the floor, shouting, as loudly as his lungs would allow, "Where are you? Call out to me." Asterisk, a weak voice answered from somewhere to his left, buried beneath the groan and crackle of burning beams. He followed the sound, his hands scraping against the hot floorboards as he crawled. The fire was everywhere now, clawing up the walls, reaching down from the ceiling. Each breath burned, and his eyes watered so badly he could barely see. Asterisk. Finally he found them, a young boy, no older than 10, huddled in the corner, his face streaked with soot, eyes wide with terror. Sundar recognized him instantly. The son of his childhood teacher. The same teacher who had stood in the street earlier that night and called out her support. The boy clutched a small wooden box to his chest, as though it were the most precious thing in the world. "It's okay," Sundar rasped, though his own voice shook. "I've got you." He scooped the boy into his arms and turned back toward the door, but the way he'd come was already a wall of flame. Panic surged through him, hot and sharp. He spun around, scanning the room through the smoke. There, a window, cracked open, just enough to let in a breath of cooler air. He staggered toward it, shielding the boy with his own body, as a burning beam crashed down inches behind him, with the last of his strength. He kicked at the frame until the glass shattered outward. Hands reached in from outside, neighbors, shouting, urging him on. Sundar passed the boy through the opening into waiting arms. Then, as his knees buckled beneath him, strong hands grasped his shoulders and pulled him out into the night. The crowd erupted in cheers and cries of relief. As Sundar collapsed on the ground, coughing violently, his chest heaving. The boy's mother was already there, clutching her son, weeping into his hair. She looked at Sundar through her tears, her face shining with gratitude and anguish all at once. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came, only a choked sob. Sundar gave her a weak nod, unable to find his own voice. Behind them, the fire still roared, but the neighbors had formed a chain, passing buckets from hand to hand, working furiously to control it. Sundar sat up slowly, his clothes singed, his lungs aching, but his heart steady. He looked around at the people, their faces lit by the flames and the faint glow of determination. Something had changed. He could feel it in the air. Rayesh's men were nowhere to be seen. The crowd had grown louder, bolder, shouting Rayesh's name now, not in fear, but in defiance. And then Sundar saw her. his mother, standing at the edge of the crowd, her back straight, her chin high, her eyes fixed on him. Pride glimmered in her gaze. She gave him the smallest of nods, and he felt his resolve harden like steel. That night, as the embers cooled and the smoke drifted away, Sundar gathered the neighborhood and the square. The burned-out husk of the house loomed behind them, but no one flinched now. He stood on a crate so they could all see him, his voice still hoarse, but strong enough to carry. "We can't stop here," he told them. "This is exactly what he wants, for us to give up, to go back to our homes, to pretend this never happened. But if we do that, he'll keep taking, from all of us. Our homes, our land, our lives. Tonight you showed him what we can do when we stand together. Let's not waste that." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some people nodded. Others still looked unsure. Sundar held up the charred papers he had rescued from the warehouse, his hands trembling slightly. "This isn't just about my family anymore," he said. "This is about every family here. Every person he's threatened, every home he's tried to steal. We have proof. And if the courts here won't listen, then we take it higher. We make them listen." He saw Christian at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, a faint smile curling at his lips. The lawyer stepped forward and spoke for the first time. "Delhi," he said simply. "If the courts here are corrupt, we go to the capital. Higher judges, a bigger spotlight, harder for him to hide there." The crowd murmured again, louder now, almost hopeful. Sundar nodded. "Delhi," he repeated. "We'll take this too." Delhi. But even as the crowd began to rally around him, his stomach twisted with unease. Rayesh was many things, but he wasn't a fool. He would strike again. And harder. Sundar didn't have to wait long the next morning. As the first light of dawn crept over the rooftops, Sundar's phone buzzed with a single message. No name, no greeting. Just 2 words. "He's mine." He froze, staring at the screen, his heart hammering. Then the door burst open, and Raymond stumbled in, his shirt torn, his face pale with fear. "They took him," Raymond gasped. "They took Ravi." Sundar blinked, trying to make sense of the words. "Who?" "Ravi," Raymond said again, his voice breaking. "The man who was going to testify, the one with the documents. They grabbed him outside his shop this morning, shoved him into a van." Sundar felt the air leave his lungs. Ravi, the witness Christian had arranged for him to meet that day. The man who claimed to have been Rayesh's bookkeeper for years, who held the keys to his secrets. Now he was gone. Sundar pressed his hands to his temples, trying to think. But the sound of Raymond's voice kept echoing in his ears. They took him. They took him until it drowned out everything else. He stood abruptly, grabbing his jacket. "Where?" he demanded. "Where did they take him?" Raymond shook his head helplessly. "I don't know. No one knows." Sundar clenched his fists, his jaw tight. But even as panic surged through him, another feeling rose beneath it, cold and sharp. Determination. He turned to Krishnan, who had appeared silently in the doorway, his expression grim. "Find out," Sundar said. "Find out where he is." Krishnan nodded, already pulling out his phone. Hours later, after frantic calls and whispered questions in dark corners, Krishnan returned with a name. An abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city. Rayesh's men were known to use it when they wanted someone to disappear quietly. The factory loomed before them at sunset, its broken windows like watching eyes, its rusted walls streaked with graffiti and neglect. Sundar and Raymond crouched behind a low wall, scanning the area. 2 guards stood at the entrance, their rifles slung lazily over their shoulders. A truck was parked nearby, engine still warm. "We'll never get in." Through the front, Raymond muttered. Sundar nodded, his eyes already searching for another way. And then he saw it, a narrow gap where the fence sagged behind the factory, half hidden by weeds. He turned to Raymond. "We go around." Inside, the air was cold and smelled of oil and dust. Their footsteps echoed softly on the concrete floor as they moved through the shadows. Somewhere ahead, they could hear voices, low, muffled, punctuated by a sharp cry of pain. Sundar's stomach turned. He pressed forward anyway, his jaw set, his fists clenched taut. And then they saw him. Ravi, tied to a chair in the center of the room, his head hanging low, his face bruised and bloody. One of Rayesh's men stood over him, a thick stick in his hand. Rage flooded Sundar's chest, hot and blinding. He didn't hesitate. He surged forward, grabbing the man by the collar and slamming him against the wall. The sound of the impact startled the others, who turned too late to stop him. Raymond was at his side now, swinging a metal pipe, shouting. Chaos erupted. Sundar tore through them with a strength he didn't know he still had. His mind focused only on one thing, getting Ravi out. The guards fought back, but the suddenness of the attack worked in their favor. Within minutes, the room fell quiet, the men either unconscious or scrambling for the door. Sundar dropped to his knees beside Ravi, cutting through the ropes with trembling hands. You're safe now, he whispered. Though his own chest still heaved with fear, Ravi lifted his head weakly, his eyes glassy but burning with something fierce. I'll testify, he croaked. No matter what, I'll tell them everything. Sundar felt a lump rise in his throat. He gripped Ravi's shoulder tightly, steadying him. Then we take this to Delhi, Sundar said. And this time we finish it. But even as he spoke, the words he caught sight of something outside the broken window, headlights flaring in the distance, drawing closer, and as the sound of engines roared through the night, Sundar realized they were far from safe. Asterisk, the ultimate showdown sound of engines outside grew louder, filling the factory with a low, menacing growl. Sundar froze where he crouched next to Ravi, the weight of the moment pressing hard against his chest. Raymond darted to the cracked window, peeking out through the grime. His face turned pale in the moonlight. There's more of them, Erlman whispered, his voice thin and tight. 4 trucks. Full of men. Sundar's mind raced. They had only minutes, maybe seconds, before Rayesh's men poured into the factory and trapped them inside. He tightened his grip on Ravi's arm, pulling him to his feet. The man's legs trembled but held, his eyes still fierce despite the pain. Sundar turned to Raymond. We can't stay here, he said, his voice low but firm. Help me get him out now. Raymond nodded, swallowing hard. Together they half carried, half dragged Ravi toward the back of the factory where they'd slipped. Earlier, the gap in the fence glimmered faintly in the distance, like a narrow promise of freedom. Behind them, the front doors of the factory banged open with a violent crash. Angry voices filled the space, boots pounding the floor, the clatter of weapons echoing off the walls. They ducked behind stacks of rusted metal sheets, moving as fast as they could without making noise. Sundar's shoulder burned from the strain of supporting Ravi's weight, but he ignored it, focusing on the cold night air just ahead. One more corner, one more stretch of shadow, and then they were through the gap in the fence, spilling out into the overgrown field beyond. Asterisk, the weeds clawed at their legs as they stumbled forward, breathing hard, hearts hammering in their chests. Behind them, shouts rose as the men realized what had happened. Flashlights cut across the darkness, beams sweeping the field like sharp knives of light. Asterisk. Keep going, Sundar hissed, his voice raw. Don't stop. They didn't stop. Not when the first shots cracked behind them, not when the earth beneath their feet turned uneven and treacherous. They ran until their lungs screamed and their legs shook, until the shouts behind them faded into nothing but the sound of their own footsteps in the night. Wind howling in their ears when they finally collapsed behind the shelter of a crumbling wall on the far edge of the field. The moon hung high and bright above them, casting its pale glow on their bruised faces. Sundar leaned against a stone, gasping for breath, his shirt clinging to his skin with sweat. He glanced at Ravi, who lay on the ground clutching his ribs, but the man's eyes were open and alive. Blazing with determination. We made it, Sundar whispered, almost to himself. Not yet, Ravi rasped. You still have to get me to Delhi. You still have to finish this. Sundar looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. We will, he said. I promise. The next morning, The three of them boarded a bus bound for Delhi, keeping their heads low as they slipped through the station. Sundar sat by the window, watching the fields and towns blur past. His mind replayed everything: the fire, the beating in the alley, the stolen papers still hidden in his bag, the roar of Rayesh's laughter as the house burned. The weight of it all pressed down on him like a stone. But beneath the fear, a quiet resolve began to burn, steady and bright. Delhi was a different world, louder, faster, more alive. The streets teemed with cars and rickshaws and people shouting over one another, the air thick with dust and heat. Sundar felt a strange sense of disorientation as they made their way through the chaos. But Krishnan was already waiting for them outside the courthouse, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. When he saw Sundar, he gave a brisk nod. "Everything's ready," Krishnan said. "The judge is expecting us. He's honest, we might finally have a chance." The hearing began in a quiet room that smelled faintly of wood and old paper. Sundar stood at the front with Krishnan by his side, the stolen documents laid out on a table before them. Across the aisle, Rayesh sat with his lawyers, his face carefully blank, but his eyes burning with something darker. Rage, yes, but also something else. Doubt as the proceedings began. Krishnan's voice cut through the still air, calm and precise as he laid out the evidence, the forged deeds, the lists of bribes, the testimony of witnesses who had come forward at last. Sundar watched the judge closely, trying to read his expression, looking for any sign of which way the wind might blow. Then it was Ravi's turn to speak. He stood slowly, leaning heavily on the edge of the table, but his voice was clear and steady as he recounted everything he knew: dates, names, amounts. He spoke of threats, of forged signatures, of money that changed hands in secret rooms. The courtroom was silent except for his words, the weight of the truth hanging over everyone like a heavy curtain. When Ravi finally finished and sat down, the judge nodded solemnly. He turned to Rayesh, who remained seated, his jaw tight, his hands clenched on the table. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" The judge asked. Rayesh stood slowly, his chair scraping across the floor. For a moment, Sundar thought he might actually speak, that he might offer some excuse, some denial. But instead, Rayesh simply smiled, a cold, sharp smile, and said nothing. The judge slammed his gavel down. The sound echoed through the room like a thunderclap. "This court finds in favor of the plaintiff," the judge declared. "The land will be returned to its rightful owners, and the defendant will be remanded to custody pending further investigation into additional charges of fraud, bribery, and arson." The words hit Sundar like a wave. He felt his knees weaken as the room erupted into murmurs and gasps. Rayesh's lawyers began shouting in protest, but the guards were already moving, taking hold of Rayesh's arms and leading him away. For the first time, Sundar saw fear flicker in the man's eyes. Outside the courthouse, the neighborhood had gathered, waiting. When Sundar stepped through the doors, the crowd erupted into cheers, the sound carrying high into the hot afternoon air. His mother was there, her sari bright in the sunlight, tears streaming down her cheeks as she wrapped her arms around him. His father stood behind her, his eyes shining, his hand resting firmly on Sundar's shoulder. "You did it," his mother whispered. "You really did it." But even as the joy of the moment swept through him, Sundar couldn't shake the memory of Rayesh's smile, that strange, knowing smile he'd given before the guards took him away. It gnawed at the edge of his thoughts, even as neighbors clapped him on the back and called his name, even as children danced around him in the street later that night. As he walked alone through the quiet neighborhood, Sundar caught sight of Raymond sitting on the steps of the burned-out house, staring at the ruins. He joined him silently, sinking onto the cool stone beside him. "It's over," Sundar said softly, more to himself than anyone. Raymond shook his head slightly. "With men like him," he said, his voice low, "it's never really over." Sundar looked at him, then back at the ruins of the house, the blackened walls, the empty windows like hollow eyes. He thought of all the damage one man's greed had caused, of the fear still lingering in the air despite the victory in court. He knew Raymond was right. This was a battle won, not the war. And then, just as he rose to leave, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A single message. No name. No greeting. Just 3 words this time. You're next, Sundar. He stared at the glowing screen in the darkness. The weight of those words settling deep in his chest. And for the first time in days, he felt a flicker of something colder. Then anger. He felt the chill of what was still to come. Asterisk. The choice. Its message on the phone glowed faintly in the darkness, as Sundar stared at it, motionless. You're next, Sundar. He read it once, then again. Then he slowly locked the screen and slid the phone back into his pocket. The street around him was quiet. The faint smell of smoke still hung in the air, remnants of the fire days before. The neighborhood slept uneasily behind shuttered windows. Sundar stood in the stillness for a long time, listening to the distant hum of the city. The occasional bark of a dog, his own heartbeat loud in his ears. He knew Rayesh still had friends. People in uniform, people in suits. He knew the man wasn't finished, even from a jail cell. And yet, as he stood there on the charred steps of the house that once belonged to his neighbors, Sundar felt no fear now. Only a steady calm, like seal cooling in water. At sunrise, he sat at the kitchen table with his parents, drinking strong chai from chipped cups. His mother watched him silently, her hands curled in her lap, worry etched into her face. His father sat straight-backed, a quiet pride and concern mingling in his eyes. You could go back now, his mother said softly. You've done enough. You have nothing to prove anymore. But Sundar shook his head gently. This isn't just about proving something, he said. This is about making sure it doesn't happen again to anyone, ever. By noon, the news had spread through the neighborhood that Rayesh's bail hearing had been moved up. Another favor from another friend in power. It granted he could walk free by the end of the week. Sundar knew that if Rayesh walked out of jail, it wouldn't just undo everything they'd fought for. It would send a message to everyone who had dared to stand up. That evening, he stood again before the crowd in the square. This time, more. People had come. Families who had once kept their distance now stood shoulder to shoulder. Children clung to their parents, wide-eyed but unafraid. Even the old teacher who had called out to him that first night stood at the front, her chin high. Sundar spoke with a quiet authority that silenced the murmurs around him. What we started here was bigger than me, he began. Bigger than my family. We showed him, and everyone like him, that we are not afraid anymore. But now he's trying to come back, trying to undo everything. We can't let that happen. Not here. Not anywhere. His words carried through. The warm night air settling over the crowd like a promise. Tomorrow, he continued, we go to Delhi again. All of us. We stand outside that courthouse, not as one man fighting alone, but as 100, 1,000, showing them we will not. Be silent. And if they still let him out, they'll have to look every one of us in the eye when they do. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, growing louder, stronger, until it became a roar of approval. Sundar closed his eyes for a moment, and let it wash over him the sound of a people finding their voice. The next morning, buses filled with neighbors rolled into Delhi. The courthouse steps were packed before sunrise, a sea of faces holding placards, candles, photographs of burned homes. Sundar stood at the front, his mother at his side, Raymond and Krishnan close behind. He didn't speak this time. He didn't need to. The people spoke for him. Asterisk when Rayesh was brought to the courthouse under heavy guard. He looked out at the crowd, and for the first time, his mask of arrogance faltered. He scanned the faces, hundreds of them, and saw no fear, no hesitation. He saw himself outnumbered, outshouted, outshone. Inside the courtroom. The judge listened as Krishnan presented one final motion, a request to deny bail permanently, citing risk of retaliation, public unrest, and overwhelming evidence of continued influence. Sundar stood at his side, silent but unflinching. Asterisk when the judge delivered his ruling. The words felt like stones being set into place. Asterisk.